What's scarier than being lost? Maybe being lost at sea, or lost in the desert. I often cover stories of being lost in the woods, but it's rare that I cover stories of being lost in other terrain. So, today I have compiled 15 of the scariest lost stories that I have ever read. If you have a story of being lost yourself that you would like to share in a future video, be sure to submit that story at swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. I would be elated to share your story with everyone here in the swamp. It's stories like yours that help keep this show going. Now, let's get into this hour of absolute scares. I've been sailing for 4 decades now, alone. Mostly. I'd like to go out and just enjoy the ocean, as well as do a fair bit of fishing. I have a smaller boat for such things. Nothing fancy or huge, but big enough to get around and comfortable enough to sleep in during the short stints I would sleep. In all my years of boating around and sailing the Atlantic, I've never had an encounter quite like the one I found myself in during the trip I'm about to speak on. First off, being I sail alone, I generally don't sleep for very long. Depending where you're at and the precautions you make, you can sometimes get real sleep on the sea. But I always train myself to sleep no longer than 2 hours at a time, as I've always been worried I'd wind up off course or worse. I'm familiar enough with the ocean, and I have comfortably slept here and there for 8-hour periods, but I had to make sure I was far out and alone as possible, and I did the prep work to be able to safely do so. That's a long story though, and I'm getting a bit sidetracked, so anyway, for the purposes of keeping my identity private, from henceforth just call me Dave. The ocean is a beautiful place, and in my opinion, it's a world all its own. Sail the seas long enough and you'll find out what I'm talking about. You'll find that when on land, you're itching to go back out again. For me, having done this sort of thing most of my life, it has gotten to the point that I consider the ocean my home. Life on land is alright, but there's nothing like the thrill and adventure of the unexpected. The ocean provides that in spades. On this occasion, I'd been out at sea for about a week. It was late May in 2012, and I was fishing and relaxing. The days had been good to me, and I was grateful for another opportunity to be out on the ocean after taking some vacation time off work. The day went wonderfully, and the week was coming to an end. I would need to head back in a few days to make sure I got some time on land before heading back to work again. Night had fallen, and the forecast called for high winds, an unsettled ocean, and some rain. This is nothing I'm not used to handling, but I decided I'd try to make it through the night and the storm before attempting some sleep. Everything was calm till about 9 p.m., when the sun had completely set and the storm had come upon me. The waters were rough, and the storm certainly made its presence known to me. This didn't bother me in the slightest, and I was fully prepared to handle myself until I heard her voice. I lost my wife to brain cancer roughly 7 years prior to this event. She was the love of my life, and I'd been with her for over 30 years when she had passed. She used to go with me on my lengthy excursions out to the ocean. She was and is the only woman I could ever or will ever want in my life. The voice I heard was my wife's. I'm positive I was awake when this happened, and the first bolt of lightning, I swore, I saw her like you might see someone standing in the distance. She looked real, and she seemed to be trying to tell me something. I obviously was very perplexed, and I thought initially maybe sleep deprivation was getting to me. I remember refocusing and looking around me, only to realize the wind was picking up immensely. My radio was beginning to dip in and out, and my boat was beginning to be slammed. Keep in mind, as I said earlier, my vessel was nice and fully capable of handling the waters, but it's also smaller, and it was only now I realized the storm was much stronger than initially forecasted. I didn't panic, as the weather taking a sudden turn is fairly common. That said, I did try to radio out, and as I did, I got nothing. The next thing I knew, I looked up in time to see a fairly large surge of water hit my boat and knock me on my feet. I tried to turn the boat, but it was too late. Before I knew it, my boat was flipped and I was thrown into the ocean. I remember trying to get my head above water and popping out, taking a short breath before, bam, I was hit by another wave and dragged under. I fought with all of my might and fury, swimming to the surface again. Gasping for air, I looked up and I swear I saw my wife. I could faintly make out 2 words: keep swimming. I know how crazy this sounds, but on instinct, I trusted my wife's voice and I swam in her direction. I had no way of knowing for sure if this was really her or how it was even possible, but in my heart, something told me to keep swimming her way. I was hit with another blast of water from the ocean. Everything was backward. Up was down, down was up, and I truly felt like I was lost. Still, I pressed on, swimming with every bit of strength I had in me, until I had time to catch my breath again. Looking out and gasping for air, I could see my wife once again. She wore the red dress she wore the night we had celebrated our 30th anniversary. I just remember focusing on her and not really thinking about anything else, but trying to keep afloat. The truth is, reflecting back later, part of me did wonder, if I died there, would I be reunited with her? Still, in the moment, I was too focused on her image and survival to give up. I pressed forward and swam with all of my might. If it weren't for her guiding image and her voice, I'm sure I'd have completely lost everything and probably would have went under. I would have drowned or swum circles until I died. Thankfully, as I got closer to my wife, I felt a renewed vigor well up within me. It was because of her, and to this day I can't explain how, that I'm still alive. I swam in her direction for what felt like forever, and I'm sure it was at least an hour, until she faded. She faded before me within a few feet. She was close enough that I could reach, but upon trying to touch her, I only saw her sweet smile, and she faded. Instead of her skin, I felt the water, and just a few feet further, my boat was sitting upright and bobbing around in the ocean. I was able to reclaim my boat soon after, and the storm died down, not much longer after that. I'm not expecting anyone to believe me, but that night, I believe my life was saved by my late wife. I can't explain it. I don't know if it was her ghost, my mind playing tricks on me, and using her image to keep me going, or something else, like some kind of weird survival trick, or if it was something else entirely, but to this day, that is the strangest and most dangerous trip I have ever taken to sea. The trip back home was uneventful. I never heard my wife's voice, saw her again, or ran into another storm or problem. I still boat today, but I wouldn't have if she hadn't been there with me that night. I won't pretend to know how or why it happened, but I'm thankful it did, and I hope when God finally decides it's my time, that she'll be waiting for me in the afterlife. My name is Jim, and I've seen all sorts of things out at sea while doing salvage work for my own private company. Salvage work involves not only boating into the ocean, but also exploring its depths in many cases. Usually for salvage from old boats or whatever our contract might ask for. You see a lot of long-term sunken ships and other interesting things. When you're really lucky, you may find treasure of a sort. I can't say I've come across treasure in the traditional sense that you see often overly glorified in Hollywood films. No, quite often, treasure comes in the form of salvaging a long-dead boat or recovering certain items thought to be lost in the seas. Sometimes it can be shipping containers, sometimes boats themselves, and other times strange oddities. I have a crew I work with, and as you can imagine, being we salvage everything from containers to whole boats and ships at times, I have a fairly large boat. My second-in-command, who we will call Eddie, does most of the diving. I navigate, and we have a crew of 6 or 7 guys whose names I will keep private for anonymity's sake. We've been at this gig for well over a decade, probably closing on 2, and in our time doing this we've seen a manner of strange things. Still, nothing has anything on this salvage. We were sent out in the Pacific to find a ship that had sunk a few months prior. The captain of the ship said strange things led to the sinking of the ship, and he claimed something strange was going on out there. Now, you have to understand, life on the sea can be exciting, but it can also be incredibly boring, and many a time you'll hear tall tales from captains or crews in any profession that revolves around being out in the ocean for any real amount of time. I often like to say, the longer the years as a captain on the sea, the taller the tales that will be spun by thee. Now, don't get me wrong. Strange things happen on the ocean, especially on longer trips, but quite often, truth is woven into a larger tale. I've never been one to spin tales, but I've always enjoyed hearing them, and this job had just the right air of spooky to make things that much more interesting. The captain of the ship we were looking for was certain this trip and his boat had been cursed after a run-in with an angry local a few weeks prior to leaving. I pried him about why he went his ship back then, but he would always get defensive and quiet, and only say he wanted to repair it if possible. Not wanting to pry too much more as the contract was very unusually well paying, my crew and I set a week sail and accepted the contract. Thinking this job would be an easy in and out and a wonderful payday. As luck would have it, things obviously didn't go according to plan. It was one of the strangest things I've ever experienced. The first days on the waters were unsettled. The weather forecast was clear skies and calm waters, but the trip toward this job was anything but. We had big winds, several thunderstorms, and completely erratic and unexplainable weather patterns. The storms were one thing. I mean, I have a large vessel, and so storms are something we can handle with ease, usually. Things grew stronger and stranger, though, as time went on. I and many of my crew would have very strange nightmares. In my nightmares personally, I'd hear a loud calling. The seas were stormy, and something felt like it lurked in the distance. There would be lightning, and I'd see the faint outline of something in the storm. Every time I was about to witness what was out there, there would be a massive billowing thunder and the brightest flash of lightning. I'd be blinded and deafened before waking up in a cold sweat and heading back on deck. I had a talk with Eddie, who explained something similar in his nightmares. We thought this strange and brought this to the attention of the rest of the crew, who all had similar stories. This was frightful, but I believed we'd all be fine, and we made a decision as a crew to continue toward the salvage. I personally felt the nightmares would make for an interesting share when we got to the shore, and also these nightly oddities only strengthened my interest in our contract. I will admit, after the first week on the waters, I began to believe there might be something to what the captain was saying. I wasn't sure why, how, nor did I entirely overthink it, but at the very least the events were strange. Our second week out, the waters were relatively calm though. The nightmares were still being had and shared. They'd always end the same way, and I'd always awake with irrational fear. The closer we got to the area where our client's ship sank, the more fear I felt welling up within me. It wasn't just me either. My crew began to get a lot shakier and seemed more on edge. A few even claimed they were having trouble sleeping, and one almost sleepwalked off the ship entirely. Thankfully, Eddie was on watch that night and was able to spot him and reach him before he made it over the edge. I, once again, partially out of kindness and partially because I was starting to second-guess myself, put continuing the job up to a vote. The votes were split more this time, but ultimately we came to the conclusion that we had come too far at this point to stop. There was also the fact that many of us were relying on this salvage's bounty for rent, bills, and all those lovely responsibilities that came with being an adult. Plus, we'd be making enough to split a healthy chunk in savings, maybe even be able to put a vacation on if we wanted to. So, we continued forward. It was the end of the second week on the water that we arrived at the coordinates where the vessel was said to have sunk. The first day of searching, we didn't find the ship. This wasn't too unusual, and we had continued our search. We figured that maybe the waters had moved it a ways, or maybe our client didn't have the exact area as his ship sank after all. I remember the first night of the search vividly. I awoke with a stir and panic so strong I thought I was having a panic attack or a heart attack at first. I wasn't alone in this feeling, as Eddie began to complain of his nightmares as well. My crew was restless, and some even claimed they were beginning to see strange things in the water at night, or even in the distance. It was too late to turn back now, without our salvage, and so we stayed and endured it. One night turned into two into 4, and before we knew it, we were almost a month out at sea. By this point, one of my men was forced to be kept under watch as he tried to harm himself one night after running onto the deck, trying to tie a crate to himself and attempting to throw himself overboard. We caught him and kept him in one of the lower holds. I had told someone watching him at all times that they would have to be very careful. He would often sleep and mumble things so we didn't understand under his breath. Almost a month and a week later, we came upon a big storm. The storm wasn't forecast. Again, the weather wasn't acting naturally. I remember this all too well because as Eddie dove, he reported finding the salvage. I obviously told him to come up as the waters were going to be uneasy soon, and sure enough, that night, we spent inside the ship keeping close watch on things. I remember a dread coming over us as we felt the ship rocking and listened in the distance. At one point I heard something outside the captain's quarters, which I'd been keeping watch on things from. There was a loud knocking. I remember there were 4 distinct knocks followed by a loud grinding sound on the other side of the door. I called out to the crew, asking for a meeting in the galley. We all came together and I asked them very sternly, making sure to keep eye contact with each of the men, about the noises at my door. I know my men, and I know when they're lying. My crew was at a loss. They all claimed to never have come near my quarters, and I believe them. They then came to me about their own odd experiences. Strange sounds at night, things moving, small things, and like creepy things. But things were also getting more intense. It started with small things being moved at first, but then it moved to larger things. Eddie and a few others mentioned hearing scurrying about late at night while on watch. Some of them described things similar to the noises at their own doors. The nightmares had continued to plague us all as well. I don't doubt we were all thinking about leaving in that moment, but we'd finally found the salvage, and we also thought if we wait a night, we might just find we'd come on the other side of the storm fine, with the salvage in tow and be able to head to friendlier waters. I told the crew to try to get some sleep, what little they could, and once the storm passed and day broke again, we'd get the ship ready and head back with our salvage in tow. Later that night, I heard an all too familiar calling. It was a thundering so loud that it shook the boat and almost sounded like a loud trumpet. I shot out of bed, and I rushed out of my quarters. I stumbled as I felt something massive hit the bottom of the boat. I stood up and went above deck, watching in the distance as the rain pelted me. Eddie was pointing in the distance in shock. Did you hear that?" he screamed over the storm. I nodded and asked him what he thought it might be. He shook his head and said he didn't have a clue. I asked him if he felt something hit the boat, and before he could answer, there was another massive boom of thunder followed by an all too familiar blinding lightning. I covered my eyes and fell to the deck. There was another immense shifting as yet again it felt like our ship was hit by something. I looked in the distance and had this eerie sense something was out there. I knew this was irrational, but nothing about this trip had seemed very rational or sane for that matter. I grabbed Eddie and we headed back below deck, waiting out the storm in our own quarters. I told my men no one is going above deck until the storm had passed without my explicit permission or an emergency of some kind. I made sure I drilled my point home and spent the rest of the night in my quarters. I don't know how to explain it, but I felt like there was something on the horizon. It felt huge. I never saw anything, as I never went above deck until the storm had passed. I eventually passed out, and when I woke up in the morning, there was a loud banging on my door. I opened up the door and saw Eddie, who informed me he'd been banging on the door for some time, and wanted to make sure I was still okay, as well as inform me the storm had passed. I told him I passed out, and soon after that we wasted no time getting our salvage in tow and hightailing it back to the California coastline. We experienced nightmares the entire journey home, but they grew less intense the closer we got there. We eventually met up with our client and returned the boat to him. We were paid, and strangely upon reaching and loading the boat, were never bothered by any sort of hallucinations, nightmares, or psychosis of any kind since. Stranger still, the man I told of on my crew who almost committed suicide was fine and far more rational after the fact. I told him he needed to see someone regardless, and we watched him for some time after. We've been on many jobs since, and I've never had any experiences like that. I'm not sure what to say other than I'm glad that we are done with that job, and I'm a lot more wary about details and contracts now. My entire crew still sails with me, and the man who experienced the mental breakdown is fine now. His therapist believed it was stress-induced, and while I believe that was part of it as well, I also believe there was more to it. I share this story to tell you I'm a firm believer in the fact that there are truly unexplainable things on and in the waters. I've never been more assured since that salvage job, so if you are out in the waters of the Pacific Ocean, or on the ocean for any real amount of time, be wary and be careful. Life on the ocean is beautiful and wonderful, as well as hard. That said, there are things that lurk in the ocean no one can explain naturally. I'm a 32-year-old female who spends much of my free time scuba diving in the Gulf of Mexico. I was on vacation last year when I came upon something I can't explain. To clear up any confusion before we begin, I dive quite a bit. It's something I've been doing for the better part of the last decade. I'm quite experienced, and this wasn't my first time in the Gulf. I've seen a manner of sea creatures while diving, but I've never seen whatever I saw during this dive before or since this dive. So the day was very calm. The waters were the perfect temperature, and all in all, up to this point, the trip had been a relaxing time. I got in my scuba gear and prepped myself prior to diving. While under the water, things were really nice. I remember looking at all the manner of sea life and just enjoying the dive. At about 100 feet down, I noticed a dark spot in the water. I'm not talking oil or anything like that. I'm talking a spot that I initially assumed might be a fish, or some kind of thing like that. Before I got closer and realized it was much larger than any fish I had ever come upon or heard of. I was about 120 feet away when I saw this motionless black mass just floating in the water. My first thought maybe it was some debris of some kind. That thought quickly left as I got closer. This thing was the size of a ship and seemed to have an almost round shape. The thing I saw was long and round, almost oval in its form. It had black skin. I'm talking it almost looked like a massive shadow. I reached out to touch this thing out of curiosity, and when I did, these strange holes opened up on its body, and what looked like little eyes appear. I remember freaking out as much as I possibly could. These larger eyes had suddenly appeared to open up as well. I don't know if the other holes were eyes or what they were. Visibility wasn't the best, but the big opening was certainly an eye. It was huge. I remember being paralyzed with fear. I could feel my breathing increasing and my heart rate beginning to spike. I felt this panic just at the sheer size of this creature. It sank into me, and I was terrified. I could feel my breathing increasing and my heart rate beginning to spike once more. I felt a drop in the ocean temperature as the thing seemed to gaze at me. I say seemed, as its pupil seemed to look black. This thing soon shut its eye in the holes, or eyes, or whatever openings were all over its body. Then it just seemed to disappear. I don't think it actually disappeared though. I think it was a camouflage of some sort. I then felt a shift, and this sudden feeling like I was being pulled slowly forward. I freaked out and attempted to swim upward, but felt myself sinking. There was another shift and a brief moment where I stopped being pulled before I was then shot upward until the water settled, and at that point, I knew whatever I had seen had dove too deep for me to see. I calmed myself and took the swim back up slowly. The rest of the trip was fairly relaxed, but I couldn't get this thing out of my mind. I didn't have a camera on me, and even if I did, I'm not sure if it would have helped. I have no idea what this thing could be or what it was. I still remember the terror that gripped me at the time, but I partly feel as though the reason I felt this way was that I was experiencing something unknown to me while diving. I've tried looking up what this might be, or if anyone has experienced anything like it while diving in the Gulf or anywhere out there for that matter. I haven't really found anything to go off of though. So, because of this, I'll leave this question to you all. Have you ever experienced this, or something equally strange while diving? I've been a fisherman all of my adult life. That's over 30 years of fishing. Sometimes though, I'd like to take some time away and fish for the sake of fishing. The following story is about such a time when I went fishing in the Bermuda Triangle. No doubt you've heard plenty of theories and mysteries on the area and why boats, planes, and all manner of things go missing there. Everything from air bombs to mysterious sea creatures to other unexplainable phenomena has been theorized and proclaimed as the reason that so many go missing in those waters. Well, I'm not claiming to know the answer, but I do have a tale about a time I tried fishing there myself, and the strange things I witnessed while out there. To start, you should know I only planned to be out there a few days initially. I'd sailed the waters before and nothing crazy had happened. So, I figured this spot was as safe as any to sail and fish again. I set out on a Friday morning in July, I believe was 2013. Maybe a year off or two as I'm older and my memory isn't too great. So I'm putting along when I notice some clouds in the distance. I think I'd better double check the forecast, and as I do so, I realize the weather seems fine. I keep an eye out and do some fishing. Things seem to be going nicely, and I'm catching myself some fair-sized fish. A few hours go by and I take a break. I have a beer, one beer to clarify, and I doze off. I awake to smack in the middle of a face from a fish and the sound of what I thought might be rain. I awake to a smack in the face from a fish and the sound of what I thought might be rain. But I quickly realize it's more fish leaping from the water and hitting the boat. I'm weirded out, but as I wake up more and start looking around, I notice the strange layer of what looks like black clouds in the sky. This cloud formation look pitch black and a fair bit nasty. I try to check the radio, and realizing it isn't getting any power. I'm not talking it's playing static, I mean it appears to be dead. This obviously makes no sense, but neither does the fish that seem to be leaping at me and trying to get into my boat. I take some binoculars and look at the horizon. This cloud formation seems to be getting closer, but I'm not noticing any wind. I'm a bit weirded out, so I look up at the formation itself. I see no rain, no lightning, only a disturbingly eerie stillness. By this point, the fish have stopped jumping at my boat. The waters are still, as the mysterious formation reaches the sun, and the sky turns an eerie color. It was like night, but I describe it as darker. I turn on a searchlight on my boat and pan around the water. I'm not sure how to explain to you why this was so unnerving, but I felt like I wanted to jump out of my skin. It wasn't the pitch black sky or the strange events that had occurred prior. No, it was the stillness of the ocean. There was an almost suffocating silence. I've never known silence to be oppressive, but believe me, this was oppressive. To add to the strange nature of the events before me, my searchlight is older and usually grinds a bit or squeaks when I move it. I moved my light and there wasn't a sound. I tried screaming and I swear I heard nothing. It was as if everything was covered by this cloud formation, was placed in a soundproof room. I remember shaking and freaking out. I pointed my searchlight to what I believed to be clouds above me only to find my light die and a hole open in the center of the formation. It was at this point I realized I couldn't even hear the ocean. There was no sound and an eerie red glow now permeating from the center of the clouds above. Looking around, the glow made the sky seem red, though I knew it couldn't have been. I looked up and noticed the red fade and the hole disappear. Everything was dark as my searchlight slowly flickered on again. Suddenly, this formation of clouds seemed to shoot forward into the sky silently and with a speed unimaginable. 1 second it was pitch black and there was no sound. In the next, the sound had returned and the sky was clear. I can't even begin to fathom what or whatever I saw might be. I can say that I know it wasn't a cloud formation. I sat down in shock for a bit. I was soon brought out of it when my boat radio sparkled to life about clear skies expected in the area. I took the fish in my boat and threw them back into the water. Shakily, I'm still baffled and terrified of the events that I went through that day. Needless to say, once I was sure the coast was clear, I turned my boat around and headed home. I haven't fished those waters ever since, and I don't plan on ever going back. I have had time to reflect on these events, and the only thing I can think of was possibly being some sort of UFO. I don't know of any similar stories to this, but what else could this have been? I would like to share a brief but creepy story about a time I was sailing in international waters. I do not wish to share where I was, as it was not entirely legal to be there at the time. Anyway, I was sailing and enjoying my day on the fresh sea breeze. I was around 24 at the time this had happened, and I'm 30 now. While sailing, I was enjoying a few shots of whiskey. I should know I can hold my alcohol. I didn't do more than 3 shots before the glass was knocked out of my hand by a sudden impact from below the boat. The impact was just enough to jostle the boat, and it made me look around to see if I could have struck anything nearby. As I scanned around and below me, I saw nothing. A few minutes go by and I start to relax. Although I can't explain what is going on, I'm confident that the time to worry has passed. I settle back down, clean up my now broken shot glass, and pull another out to drink the 4th shot. As I'm about to drink, I hear a loud and deeply unsettling moan from below. Moan is the best way I can explain it, as it was quite loud. No sooner do I try to gather my senses and drop my whiskey, sad waste, do I feel a thud from the bottom of the boat that is hard enough to lift it off the water for a split moment. I fall to the bottom of the boat, scramble up and look around again. At first I see nothing. A few seconds later, I thought I saw the outline of a massive creature underneath the boat. It was as though it is swimming underneath the boat, and although I can't see what it is, the thing is big enough to leave a shadow farther than I can see while looking down. This monster speeds up, and as it does, I can feel the boat being pulled along with it a bit. I feel the boat spin, and I try to keep it straight as the creature pulls ahead. It isn't long before I see those black, almost spike-like scales, somewhat surface from the water. I'm in shock and pull some binoculars out. I look at the scales, which have very sharp, almost quill-like spikes. They have this little shine to them as well, if that makes any sense. I sat there and settled on the water for a few moments, before I was able to finally come back to my senses and turn my boat around. I headed back after that, and I'm not sure what I saw, but I'm quite sure it just wasn't a whale or something like that. Any of you guys have any ideas what it could have been? So, I'm an alien geek. I like the idea of aliens, and I think it's cool to think of how big the universe is and all that. However, I am pretty skeptical that there are beings visiting us just to mess with our crops, mutilate some cattle, and probe us and peace out. I know there are other reasons and theories behind visitations, but dang, why don't we have more concrete evidence? All that being said, I remain an alien geek enough that I took a 2-hour detour while driving my family from Las Vegas to Salt Lake City to drive by Rachel, Nevada, and see Area 51. We wanted to get some souvenirs. We were running late, so by the time we got back on Highway 93 to head up into Utah, it was probably 10 p.m. and super dark outside, but the stars were bright because there is nothing out there. We were probably 60 miles from the last car we had seen in Rachel, and that is when we saw something. The whole encounter took probably a minute and a half. First, I saw a horizontal arc or semicircle of about 12 lights that flashed on and were brighter than anything else in the sky. When I saw them, I just yelled to my wife, "What am I looking at?" She just gasped and questioned further. The semicircle sequentially blinked off after a few seconds, and we were left questioning. It was below the scattered clouds, and I started guessing at what it could have been. Maybe airplane flares, but they did not seem to be moving. Of course, being the hopeful skeptic that I am, my eyes are glued to the sky. But 20 seconds later, I see something darkening the clouds in front of us, like I could see it swoop in front of the stars. That is when the same brightness, dozen or so lights, turned back on in a clear triangle shape, and a few seconds later, another grouping of lights blinked on next to the triangle, creating a diamond. The diamond shape was not connected to the triangle, and it seemed to be static since it was shining through a light cloud. Mind you, these second lights were clearly surrounded by a cloud, but they were not dimmed at all by the cloud. But both shapes were perfectly symmetrical and seemingly facing us, the only people within 50 miles. These lights tracked us for about 15 seconds, and I yelled to my wife to grab the phone for a camera. Almost the instant she brings up the camera, the lights goes out. We see another flash far above the clouds a few seconds later, but they are gone. My question is, what on earth did I see in the middle of the Nevada desert 2 days ago? When I was 10 years old, I was out camping in the desert with my family and friends. This was something we had done every summer since I was very young. There were usually 3 to 6 families, all with multiple children, and we would set up a large camp. One of our families, good family friends, owned a trucking company and was into all kinds of vehicles. They would typically bring a huge trailer with about 10 to 15 ATVs, motorcycles, sand buggies, etc. Then, everyone else brought a few of their own. This ensured there was always something to ride for everyone there, even the kids, as there were multiple 80cc quads. We would go out on large excursions with all these people, driving through the Mojave Desert to various locations. I'm guessing the adults had previously scouted out some interesting destinations. This time, I guess they wanted to scare us. First, we went to an old abandoned mental hospital, or so they claimed. This place had a huge Olympic-sized swimming pool, which was completely destroyed and almost deeper than anything I've ever seen pool-wise. It was filled with all kinds of trash and old burnt-out cars, and the usual leftovers of humanity. It was 3 stories inside, extremely large, and was completely empty. Some of the older kids were jumping through the halls, which were extremely old and brittle drywall, pretending to be the Kool-Aid Man and such, breaking through walls. Shortly before we left, a couple of the younger girls, they were standing on the porch upstairs, and apparently it nearly collapsed while they were on it. I didn't see what happened, I just knew they were terrified and a lot of parents were upset about it. Next, we went to an old abandoned shack. This is when things got weird. We started exploring this shack, which was like a 1-bedroom cabin, and it was obvious that someone was still living there. I can't recall exactly, but I think there were food scraps, water bottles, and clothing strewn about. This was extremely unnerving, because this place was completely decayed and on the verge of collapse. Suddenly there was a big commotion from the bedroom, and people were saying that we should take pictures, and generally looked like they had seen something strange. Of course, we all headed into the bedroom. In the middle of the ceiling was a dead, tropical parrot. There was a hole in the ceiling and his head was stuck through it, and it was just hanging there. At this point, I remember someone approached it, reached out towards it, and suddenly it started spasming, and everyone started screaming and freaking out. It twisted loose or something and took off through the window, which was just an opening in the rotted wood at this point, and flew away. That was the end of our excursion for that day. We all rode home, and in retrospect, I realized that whatever or whoever was scouting these places out apparently wasn't doing their due diligence and bringing 20 children along with them to play in abandoned desert structures. This happened to me when I was in high school. When I was around 16 years old, and although I may not have been in immediate danger, it still shook me up. I lived in a small desert town in California at the time, where there wasn't much to do in forms of entertainment if you were under the age of 21. The main population of the town is either elderly or gay, so any teenagers that lived there were kind of ignored. I hung out with an interesting group of girls who were not into drinking or recreational use of drugs, which was a pretty rare thing from where I was from. We were the honor roll kids, but that didn't mean that we didn't get into our fair share of trouble from time to time. We enjoyed urban exploration, breaking into abandoned buildings. There were a lot of abandoned country clubs and shut down outlet malls in the area, where we spent a lot of our time. There were a couple of times we have gotten into some serious trouble with the law enforcement, but we were at that age where you feel invincible, like nothing could possibly happen to you. Sometimes, the places we went weren't abandoned though. Just closed or having construction done. Those places were sometimes harder to get into, but were closer to populated areas and generally safer. The playground attached to the preschool was small, intended for toddlers. It had a short brick wall around the front, with much taller walls along the sides. The back wall was the tallest, must have been over 9 feet with street lamps overhanging. The light of it was spilling into the school's driveway. All we had to do was hop over the 4-foot wall in the front to get in. We had to be cautious that night, because for some reason, there were cars coming down the road, which I had previously mentioned people rarely used. Patiently, we waited for a car to go by, crouched along the wall. Then, once the headlights no longer had the preschool in view of what we would hop over, we jumped in. I remember throwing the snacks over at one point, and when I threw the jug of Arizona iced tea, one of my friends failed to catch it and the lid popped off from the impact. A small geyser of tea flew up into the air, and we all laughed. I was the last to go over the wall, mostly because I was not very athletic and was more likely to fall and land on my feet. I waited for another car to pass before jumping over, so I wouldn't be seen. It was a red pickup truck. I remember distinctly. I didn't think too much of it, hopped over after it passed. With the way the street lamp hung over the playground was set up, the light actually didn't illuminate the playground, but the roundabout driveway in front of it, leaving us in shadow. Which was perfect, as it meant that no one would even see us if they looked into the playground. We quickly found a bench to sit on and started eating our junk food and talking quietly, trying to keep our laughing from being too loud. We were sat for maybe 30 minutes when we noticed that a car pulled into the roundabout driveway. We went silent and ducked as the headlights turned our way. The car drove back onto the road and out of sight. We assumed that the person probably wanted to turn out without driving all the way to a stoplight and then left it at that. Another 5 minutes and it happened again. A car drove into the driveway. We assumed it would be for the same reason, and that they just wanted to turn around. But the car stopped. It idled for a good while, maybe 2 or 3 minutes. My friends and I got nervous. We didn't know what someone would be doing at a preschool in the middle of the night, besides us, obviously. I noticed absently that it was a red pickup truck. Finally, The person inside got out, leaving the car on. He walked straight up to the 4-foot wall and stared into what could have been, from his perspective, darkness. Above us, there was an overhang to provide shade for the bench that we were sat at, giving us an even greater cover of darkness, so we could not have seen our now crouched forms. The strange thing is that the way the light was, we couldn't see his face, but I could make out that he was an older white male, probably in his late 30s, with a shaved head. He was wearing a button-down shirt and slacks, but I could not see his face. The man continued to stand there, seeming to stare at us. He said nothing, which freaked us out the most. If he was there to tell us to leave, why didn't he say anything? And if he couldn't see us, why didn't he leave? I could hear the pickup still idling. I wanted to escape, but he was standing there just like smack dab in the middle of the smaller wall, and there was no way to get out. What if he grabbed one of us? One of my friends touched my arms to get my attention. Without any words, they motioned to the other 4-foot wall. It connected to one of the side walls on the left. On the other side of that wall was an empty lot that led into the desert. That wall had a jump of around 7 or 8 feet. But if you stepped where the shorter wall connected to it, you could leverage and jump over it. I was scared. I was not fast or athletic in the slightest. What if I fell or couldn't pull myself over the wall? I didn't want to keep sitting there with this strange man staring at me anymore, though. The same friend that got my attention before got us all to look at her as she held up her fingers to count down. We were all going to try to get over the wall at once. When she got to 1, I bolted, leaping on top of the shorter wall, vaulting myself over to the other side of the wall, and then not worrying about where I landed. I somehow ended up landing in a roll instead of on my feet. I sprung up and started running towards the nearest light source, a Ralph's. I didn't stop until I was in front of the store, and that's when I looked around and realized that my friends were with me. All 4 of us had made it out. While we stood in front of the Ralph's, catching our breath, some of us letting our nerves get out by laughing, I noticed a car pulling up into the parking lot. The same red pickup truck. The windows must have been tinted, because once again, I was unable to see the person that had been watching us. We couldn't go inside to the store because it was closed. There were still cars in the parking lot, probably belonging to the employees inside. I don't know why we didn't call for help. Maybe we felt as though we would get in trouble for being where we shouldn't. The red pickup didn't stop, but instead circled the parking lot several times. Each time the car passed us, I felt like he was going to get out and snatch one of us. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he gave up and drove away. We took off running right away to the nearest friend's house since we all lived so close together. Once we reached our destination, we collapsed on the lawn, and we talked about how freaky that whole experience was. Tonight, my sister, brother-in-law, 2 friends, and I piled into my truck, and we headed out to a desert area near an old Cal Portland concrete factory. About a half hour into drifting, kicking up dust and messing around, everyone gets the chills, and my anxiety starts to flare up a bit. We brush it off as the temperature difference and keep going. 10 minutes later, we come around a corner, and my sister says, "Please tell me you guys just saw that woman." We respond, "What woman?" And she says, "We just passed a woman, standing on the side of the road wearing a pink shirt. She had blonde hair and it was covering her face, and she looked dead." I honestly thought she was messing with me. So, we turn around and go to the spot that she saw the lady, and there was no woman there. My brother-in-law and I get out with flashlights and look around. No woman. I tell my sister she's seeing things, and she insists that she saw this woman. So, I decided to check my dashcam footage. Sure as shit, there was a woman. She was crossing the road. It looks like, and then she just vanishes into thin air. My camera isn't the best quality and it was extremely dark, but it's very clear what she saw. My brother-in-law and I canvassed a 2-mile square radius on foot with flashlights, calling out to this woman because we legitimately thought there was someone lost out in this desert. The entire time we kept feeling and hearing things all around us. I live with my grandmother and my grandfather. Not getting into why I do, just so you know. I live in a small town in the middle of a desert. I'm not saying what state or the name of the town for privacy. Well, here is how it all started. Me and my family were looking for a new house while going to see other parts of my family for Thanksgiving. We came across this little town in the middle of a desert, and it had a restaurant, so we stopped there and ate. We loved the town, so we started looking for houses. We came across many of them, but there was one that we loved. It had a sandy yard, trees surrounding the front of the house, a screened-in front porch, and a huge back deck. The place was beautiful. It had a for sale sign on the fence around the place, so we called the number on it and bought it. We'd never expected anything to happen at first, but then we found out the previous owners died. But not in the house, but they are dead. Then things started happening. The first thing occurred when my aunt was looking in the closet in the master bedroom and said she saw a shadow person standing in there. She freaked out and turned pale. The second incident happened to my grandfather. He was sleeping in the living room, and since we did not have any beds there, he looked down to the hallway and he saw a mist with the lady in a wheelchair in the mist. This is the third incident, and this one happened to me. It's the scariest one in my opinion. I was staying up late one night, playing games on my Xbox 360, and I got thirsty, so I decided I wanted to go get something to drink. So, I went to the kitchen, and my kitchen is connected to my living room, so you can see through the kitchen into the living room. But when I got to the kitchen, it was not what I expected. I saw a lady coming from the living room into the kitchen walking towards me. I bolted back to my room and slammed the door shut. Later, I came back and found all of the cupboards open and a chair from the kitchen and a lounge chair in the living room upside down with a pillow on top of it. It had one of my pictures and a few of the cupboards in the chair. It was just so weird. I just can't explain it. And to this day, I'm still at a loss for words. This is one of the most recent occurrences, and it's one of the biggest occurrences. I was trying to find something in the closet in the master bedroom where my aunt saw the shadow person, and the door shut by itself, and something grabbed my leg and pulled me back into the closet. I just don't know how to explain these events. They're some of the scariest things I've ever experienced. So I am currently 20 years old. And this story happened either when I was 16 or maybe 17. I was out with a bunch of friends, wreaking havoc around our hometown, as teenagers do. And about 9 or 10 p.m., after the sun had set, we spontaneously decided that we wanted to go camping. We live in Arizona, east of Phoenix, and in our area, there was a lot of open desert where people often threw parties or camped or shot guns at random garbage for fun. If you look up the Superstitious Mountains, you can get an idea of where we were. We went to our usual spot and got a fire going, and just hung out for a little bit. We didn't have any drugs or alcohol. In total, there were 6 of us. I believe myself and 4 other guys and 1 girl. After a bit, 4 of us went to take a walk, while 2 of the guys stayed behind and kept the fire going and under control. We didn't have any flashlights or anything to light our way as we walked down a trail into the dark desert. However, it was a mostly full moon of cloudless night, and we pretty much could see everything around us, within 50 feet probably. Typically, we didn't go far from the campsite, because it was nighttime and it's a very sketchy place in the desert at night. But with 4 of us, we knew we'd be alright. After we were out of visible distance of our campsite, mostly due to lots of tiny hills more so than distance, we were all just talking and laughing when we noticed this weird glowing figure. It is very hard to describe accurately, but I would say that the figure was about 4 feet tall. We were maybe about 25 feet from it. It appeared to glow a whitish-greenish color and stayed entirely still. One of my friends said it looked like a boy with a large glow, making him very blurred and difficult to see. But I personally saw a blur of light. Also, my friend didn't mention this detail until the next day, so it could be made up, who knows. I don't know which one of us spotted it first, but it was all too obvious that we all saw it. It just gave us this urge to run. I instantly thought about horror movies where people get split up and are even more vulnerable, and quietly, calmly told my friends that we should not run and we should just try to be as calm as we can. Because if this were any kind of animal, like a mountain lion, bobcat, coyote, or whatever, it could get startled and attack. There were also some free-range cattle out there, so we didn't need to anger any bulls, though it was definitely not a bull. We all slowly walked back towards the campsite, with myself and one of my guys watching to make sure nothing followed us. But this figure was quickly hidden by a small hill after we walked maybe 30 seconds. At this point, my rationality kicked in and I decided that we must have just been seeing things. My logic was, there are lots of old street signs and random crap in the desert, so maybe the moon reflected off a sign and we overreacted. My friends agreed, and we cautiously walked back over to the hill, towards where we saw the figure. It wasn't until we had walked past where the figure was standing that we realized it was gone. At this point, we were pretty freaked out, so we went back to the fire quickly and carefully. At the campsite, the other 2 guys thought we were pranking them, but when we started hearing this squealing, chirping noise, almost like a bird and much more distorted and creepy sounding, it sounded like it was approaching us. By this point, our nerves got the best of us. We dumped a ton of water on the fire, packed the truck, and got out of there. We searched 2 or 3 more times for the figure in the glowing week, both during the day and at night, but we never saw anything similar to it again. And despite that experience, we camped there again without anything out of the ordinary happening. I still do not know what it was. It was summer. I believe the day after 4th of July. My husband and I were in the middle of a cross-country road trip. We were driving through Texas, and for any of you who have ever driven across the entire state of Texas, you know that it is very long and very barren. Sometimes we go without seeing anything for hours at all, and the towns we did pass through didn't consist of much more than a rusty gas station and a few dusty little houses. Looking out the window, you would swear you were just driving through the same 5 miles of desert, again, and again, and again. I had started getting a headache, and my husband suggested that I take a quick nap to get rid of it. I remember allowing myself to doze off as I watched the beautiful colors of a desert sunset. The slowing of the car woke me up, and the first thing I noticed was how dark it was. I believe it was around 10 p.m. My husband had stopped at a gas station with a small shop. He told me he was going to grab us some food and asked if I needed to pee. Knowing I might not have another chance for quite a while, I went into the shop to use the bathroom. Both the men's and women's restrooms were down a little hall from the open area of the shop. I was groggy and tired and realized how badly I needed to pee, so I shuffled into the restroom. As I made my way to the short distance from the door to the nearest one of the 2 stalls, I made eye contact with a woman coming out of one of the other stalls. She didn't look quite homeless, but she was definitely messy looking. She had wild gray hair, almost shoulder length. It's like it hadn't been touched or brushed in weeks. She was wearing a ragged looking clothing, a pair of ill-fitting black workout shorts, and I remember noting her foam flip-flops. Several layers on top, one of them being a large purple and green coat. Keep in mind that it's Texas in July. The jacket was just hanging on her shoulders, crooked like she hadn't been bothered to take a few more seconds to put it on correctly. She was carrying something in a tied-up plastic grocery bag. I gave a quick smile as our eyes met, and she just stared at me in return. Then her face turned wild and intense looking. Her eyebrows were set as if she was angry, but her eyes looked wild. She looked at me as if she was hungry, and this is when I felt the first tinge of something wrong. I tried to brush it off. She waddled over to the only sink, and I took my time shutting the stall door because something about her posture in front of the mirror struck me as odd, and I was trying to figure it out. She was standing with her body more angled toward me, but her face was turned to the mirror. Her body was tensed, legs slightly crouched as if she was ready to act. Her hands were not up by her face for trying to fix her mess of hair or even being washed. They were at her sides, also slightly bent. I wasn't sure why, but I suddenly felt uncomfortable. I regretted leaving my purse and cell phone behind. I shut and locked the stall door and took my time using the toilet. I wanted her gone before I left the safety of the stall. I stayed there long after I had finished, but the woman was still there, so I waited longer. Finally, I heard the smacking of her flip-flops as she made her way to the door. I heard it open and then slam closed. The door was pretty heavy and had slammed the same way when I had entered. I stayed for a moment and allowed the wave of relief to wash over me before I reached for the lock, then paused. My fingers only an inch from the lock, I stayed as silent as I could as I managed to confirm that what I had just heard. Yes, breathing. The woman had only pretended to leave. At this point, I was scared and confused. Why had she tried to trick me into thinking she had left, only to stick around and be as quiet as possible? I knew something was very wrong, so I stayed in the stall even longer, and this time, it must have been at least 20 minutes, but I had no way of knowing for sure. I could not tell from the direction of her breathing where she was. I couldn't see her feet or anything, so I just had no idea. Finally, I heard her leave. This time I waited a few minutes to make sure she hadn't tried her trick again. I slipped out of the stall, quickly washed my hands, and rushed down the hallway to the store. It was pitch black outside and I had no idea where she was. She couldn't be far. A large man was checking out at the register, so I waited near a window display until he left the store and quietly slipped out the door behind him. Sure enough, crouched outside the front door is the woman. She seemed surprised as she stood and turned away, walking quickly around the side of the store. My husband was waiting in the car and asked me if I was okay since I had taken so much longer than usual, and I said that I would tell him about it once we were away from that store. My old roommate moved to California this weekend, and some friends and I drove to help her move in and check out the new place. I left a lot later than everyone else, so I ended up driving alone. I live in Arizona, so the drive is only about 6 hours from where I live. When I was driving there, I didn't see anything strange, other than a lady walking her dog in nothing but a bra and panties when I was filling up gas at the station that was basically in the middle of a desert. No, not really pertinent to the story, but I just thought it was strange. Anyway, I got to my friends at about midnight. Like I said, I left really late. I only stayed for a day and left the next night. Before I left, I told my friend I would take her back with me, since she lives fairly close to me, so why not kill two birds in one stone? When we left, we took a different route than I came. When I was heading there, I took the Interstate 10. Coming back, I took the Interstate 8. If you aren't aware of the area, there are a few things you should know. Interstate 8 is basically on the border of Mexico, and driving from probably anywhere to Arizona, if you can imagine, it's all rock and desert terrain. It was 9 or 9:30, and I don't remember if I was in California or Arizona at the time, but I think it was Arizona. It probably doesn't really matter. Anyway, as we were driving down this road, we saw this really bright light that seemed to be at the top of a rock. These roads aren't so well lit, so it was really out of the ordinary to see this light in the middle of the desert. At first, we thought it was a light-up pole, but as we got closer and we got a better look at it, mind you, I was going at about 80 miles per hour, so I was going pretty fast, but when we got close enough to see it, I swear to God it was a man. This thing, whatever it was, had a head, arms, a body, and legs to it, and it was glowing, like its whole body was made of light. I thought I was driving too fast because I wanted to keep an eye on the road, so I only got like a half glance at it, but my friend looked at me and asked if I saw it too. "You saw a man, right?" The rest of our drive was in silence. We haven't talked about it, but I can't help but thinking that I saw something that I shouldn't have. Maybe I'm just paranoid, and it was just a trick of my eye or something. But if someone knows about this or has ever seen whatever this is too, please let me know. I'm just going to cut to the chase. My mother was arrested for drug possession one summer evening this year. My ex-roommate and myself were invited to stay at my mother's friend's house that very night because the house was experiencing severe problems regarding the electricity and power. It was about midnight when we began to turn off the lights as well as the TV and prepare for bed. About 20 minutes later, I hear what sounds exactly like my mother's voice calling my name from what I assume was outside. It absolutely shocked me, so much that I shot up like a bullet and stared directly at the front door in the distance. I thought I was going insane when I asked my roommate if she heard it too. She replied with a yes, and I had just had a meltdown. I learned that morning that my mother was in the police department all night, which was a pretty good damn far distance from the house that we were residing in. I've experienced paranormal activity just about my entire life. Everything ranging from blue lights hovering over our desert town, only to shoot across the sky in a blink of an eye, to ghostly women gripping my hands when I was a child and leading me to different places within the deserts. Perhaps one of the weirdest was some kind of canine hollering sounds that I've never heard before, but not from a dog or coyote or any local wildlife that I'm familiar with. It just didn't seem natural nor right. I always try my best to remain skeptical about supernatural or the paranormal, but goddamn, that voice mimicking my mom was absolutely wild. Thanks for listening to these creepy and allegedly true lost stories. I don't know about you guys, but being lost is one of my biggest fears. Not knowing where to go, and just, I guess, being left to the elements. If you enjoyed these stories, please hit that like button, as it helps me out a ton. Be sure to comment down below which story was your favorite. I'd love to know. If you have a story of your own that you would like to share in a future video, be sure to submit that at swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. I'd love to share your story with everyone here in the swamp. You can download your favorite Swamp Dweller scary stories on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher Radio, and just about everywhere else you download your favorite podcast. I appreciate all of the support you guys give the swamp on a daily basis. If you guys aren't aware, recently, me and my good friend and fellow narrator, Unit number 522, have started a metal band. We put out our first song and are about to put out another one soon. In the top of the description, you can find a link to check out our music. It would really mean a lot to us if you checked it out, maybe left us a comment, and told us what you thought. Thank you guys so much, and I'll see you guys soon with another creepy video.